Okay, this is a chapter out of a book that I found. It's called Erectus Walks Amongst Us. And I got here in a kind of strange way. Egyptologist 7 recently made a video which used a piece out of one of my other videos, and we texted back and forth and so on. She made the video, and then we had a little over 3 hour conversation that was quite enlightening. We talked about all kinds of things in this, and whenever I had mentioned to her right off the bat about her naming there, she said that there was a book that was correlated to this that someone had written, and you ought to check it out. But it's kind of old even. And so I looked it up, and it's from 2007. We'll get into that in a minute. We talked about a lot of things, and I might do a series of videos just off what we talked about. And again, I ran through a bunch of connections and stuff on her, and kind of anyhow, whenever I was studying biology, I did it in 8th grade in physical science, and everybody knows that, and you learn the tree of life and so on. But when you get into college, it gets a little more in depth into it and so on. And then I went into, as I said, to fish studies and took the ichthyology courses that go along with that. And it can get quite fibrated, and there's a myriad of different fishes, and it doesn't take much to make them be different than each other, although in the same tree or on that same little branch, but it's different. And sometimes it's happened from locality change and over time, but other times, and other times it's basically different fin counts, different dorsal ray fin counts. If you look at a dorsal fin on the fish that sticks up on top, like a shark, there's little bitty rays in there, and there's amounts that are counted for each one. Also, something that's unseen usually, but if you ever go bass fishing or anything, you grab a fish in his mouth and open it up, and you can see the gills inside there. And then there's this secondary unit, it's called a gill raker, and sometimes just in the way the gill raker is shaped and so on like that, they give different nomenclature to these. And so we work off of binomial nomenclature, and that really just means genus and species, and working off of a double classification. And it even seemed weird to me back whenever we were doing this fish and getting deep into it that some areas were quite lacking and other ones weren't. And certain names came up, and old people and stuff, and I used to have a lot of them memorized. At one time I could probably nowhere near do it now, but I could pretty much in the whole atlas of ichthyology name every genus and species of every fish and tell you where their locality was and what their general diet was, things like that, and probably something weird about them too. Also what their Latin name means in most cases and so on, things like that. It's not really important, but when we got down deep into it, you could tell that certain genus of fish that we were talking about seemed somewhat strange. And one of those was cichlids, which is one of my favorite fish. It's not the little bitty different fish, which are very beautiful, but the big guys that kind of eat them. The kind of perch and bass of the tropical world, if you will, in freshwater. And they get all kinds of different shapes a little bit and different colorations on them. And you can, by mixing ones that are compatible with each other, you can get quite a decent display too. You can have them also breed, and there's been a bunch of hybrids that have happened, and a lot of those hybrids happen from fish that those rivers they come out of are not connective. It's one way that they can tell that they never had connection to them, because there are areas of the Amazon way up and to the right, if you will, mentally, and way back towards the throat of it and off to another jaunt that's off here. And those type of fish never have really intermingled because they are so far apart. There are other parts of the Amazon that actually flood all the way up, and even though it would appear on a normal situation that there would never have interaction due to the flooding, all kinds of things can happen and then a resettling. Sounds kind of biblical, huh? Well, there's more to it than that, but looking at all these cichlids and things that came out, something looked odd, and lo and behold, 15 years after I was through with that and was deep into the hobby, they decided to just totally reclassify cichlids altogether. Cyclosoma and its properties and its mainstay of the heart of it became something totally different, and they went into Heros and Erectus and different species and just totally reclassified it because they were incorrect in the first place. And the original cichlids that they got cyclosoma from, and the cichlid word itself from, became not really the holotype if you were to take it all into conjunction, but it was one of the little left fields, if you think on it the way I'm talking about, right? Not to go too deep into it, but that kind of gives you a little idea of it. And I used to have little arguments to where this one was that one, and these little bitty cichlids that are no more than 2 inches long, called epistogrammas, and different fin counts and different fin shapes and so on like that, and whether they were distantly related or not, and so on, and finding, traits that their females have and their sexual dimorphism that they have that went along with other things that didn't go into others, and then finally figured out that that's not all one group, but it's kind of two, and this other one is really a dwarf kind of thing of these other types that there used to be a bunch of different of, but really you don't see if they even exist anymore. It's kind of strange in that book, just like a bunch of creatures you think of on land and they may have lost their habitat and done things, this same thing happens to fish, because some of these are just in running streams and so on that really become active and then start to dry away, and then become active again and dry away. And in certain areas, again, it floods all in, and there's arowana fish and all kinds of exciting things. So I'll have to do some more videos about that and get off of that and onto this. But that study that we're talking about there is taxonomy, right? And so this person in chapter 28 goes into it, but instead of talking about fish, he's talking about people. But he's also going to talk about wolves and other creatures. And so you can comparative-wise look at the way that they treat and talk about them. Because fish had this same kind of little difference, but it was different, but the same problem. And then a portion of them, which is the mainstay of the cichlids, got reclassified over time. This man is known as Richard D. Furl. I guess that's how you pronounce it, Furl. It's the book is called Erectus Walks Amongst Us, rather than just amongst us. The Evolution of Modern Humans by Richard Furl. The author is a retired patent attorney who lives on a small wildlife refuge on an island in upstate New York. He's a perpetual student. He has degrees in math, law, economics, physics, and chemistry, and he is an amateur composer, along with studying biology, philology, if you will, and apparently pretty well versed in human lineages, off looking at current knowledge. And again, this was at 2007, so some of the recent finds I'll try to interject here while we go through this, and I don't think it'll go to 2 parts, but you know what happens whenever I say that. So let's get into it. Again, this is in his book, and it's chapter 28. Chapter 28 was known as Homo africanus. All men belong to the same species, was stated in UNESCO statement July 18, 1950. Before that point, it hadn't really been clarified at all. And of course, UNESCO coming out like this was something that a lot of people saw as they were usurping the point of them trying to put out an agenda that still, well, it went on before then, but it goes on to this day. Taxonomy is an obscure word, though. It has simple meaning: the classification of living things. Scientists classify plants and animals using the Linnaeus classification system. And whenever I first heard that, let's talk about fish again. Whenever you hear these Latin words, there was a lot of times where you would hear this word linneaus and variations of. And what that was usually a fish that had some portion of or down his body were lines. And so it made sense. But I found one very early whenever I was doing all these fish and going through all the names and getting it down. And lo and behold, there was one named Linnaeus. And I said, you know, this one doesn't have lines on it though. And he goes, look closer, that's Carl Linnaeus. And I had already heard the name. He's one of the guys that helped classify fish, in fact, work on this entire scale that we do here. He's famous in taxonomy altogether. In fact, had fish named for him and other animals named for him. This happened to quite a few different people. It's kind of shunned nowadays, and they want you to pick something that is radically different about it in that genus for that binomial nomenclature, so people can have something different, not just that it has the person's name with an I on the end to make it sound Latin. This Linnaeus classification system, where each species is identified by a Latin genus and species name, such as Homo sapiens, occasionally a Latin name for the subspecies will also be added, such as Homo sapiens sapiens, which seems extremely odd. You never see that anywhere else, and we're going to talk about the differences of the way that men are being treated, or humanity, women, and all that, and every little letter in rainbow you can put onto it. But humanity is looked at as being somehow not quite fitting with the regular look of this scale that we have here. Much more radically different than any fish thing that I just talked about. But you hear such things as Homo sapiens sapiens, so that doubled up on it, because we had Homo sapiens, modern human, at over 200,000 years. Now, recently, they found Jebel Irhoud at 315,000 years. But it still exhibits some prognathism and so on, and really a modern human looks like it finds itself at about 140,000 years. And so the whole out of Africa theory that we're going to speak about here, and I did a recent video on too, not more than a month ago, and probably less, was referring to the fact that it really didn't work out that way at all, that there are quite a few differences. And it wasn't some smooth little da-da-da-da-da. And the idea of people changing because of not seeing enough sunlight or doing things is just a minor factor in the hybridization and all kinds of things that went on. And also that ancient hominid species from long ago just lived on almost until a modern age and then changed. We've done videos about that. We'll get into that a little more as we go into this, and gosh, it's probably going to go to a two-parter. If and when it does, it'll be in your top left-hand corner. But let's get into this idea here. So here's the classification for man. This is number 1 on this list that I've finally gotten to now. Kingdom. This is separated in different ones, but we're looking at animals, which means living things other than bacteria and plants, like flora and fauna. Well, we're looking at the fauna. And the phylum, and this is Chordites, which is people that have spinal cords, basically, chordata, have spinal cords. But there are other creatures that have spinal cords, so we have to break it down more and more and more, of course. And so there's a subphylum of that, which is vertebrates, which have bony spines and skulls, not something like a shark where it's cartilage and all the other situations, and the corals that have things that are similar to this, and fish and so on. Because we get into the next classification separation, and it is mammals, which are warm-blooded with hair and have four-chambered hearts, and the second part of that is that females nourish their young from using mammary glands. And even whenever you look at something like whales and dolphins and so on like that, that's actually a mammal that's swimming constantly in the sea, like a mermaid type thing. But they're not people, they're a fish type thing. Same thing goes on with manatees. But then other than that, we are in an order of primates. This is mammals with an opposable thumb. So this is your hand, and you've got an opposable thumb that you can grab things with. This would be man, apes, monkeys, lemurs, and tarsiers. But you break it out of order and you go into family, and it's hominids. Bipedal primates, which is extinct bipedal primates and apes, and extinct versions of man and living man. And then the genus that we have, which is where we get the class and the strict point at, is Homo. It means that they're, other than all that went on, they were tool-making hominids. And this can range very far and can be from habilis, ergaster, erectus, and archaic man, and then through to living man too. So there must be a subspecies that goes on there known as species. And this is sapiens. This is extinct, nearly modern man, Neanderthals and living man he refers to. But we'd also, until recently, thought Cro-Magnon would be, but then we find Cro-Magnon's DNA is still here. In fact, they are still here from over 50,000 years ago. And their DNA still working out. So it's gotten much more different and convoluted whenever you look at that timeline versus others, and switching late, if ever. We'll get into that more. So then we have the subspecies, which we put on sapiens, and it's sapiens sapiens, which is the modern man. And I guess the holotype of modern man would be the most modern man that you could find around, and this is probably got to be those flying spacemen. And so we're looking at Caucasians because they are the holotype of the modern man that all this classification was built upon in the first place. But they seem to also have the longest longevity of being modern humans out of everybody on the planet, and over and above that, they seem to be the most modern form and do the most modern things, and brought modernity to humanity. Civilization too, by the way, and a few other things. So looking into it, he says there are no labels on plants and animals, however, that tell us what their classification is. Nature does not classify her critters. Only man classifies things that are or were living. Yeah, there's no like stamp on the butt of something, and all you have to do is look up the tail and go, oh, okay, this is a jackal and this is a wolf. In fact, we'll get into that later, and I'll talk about it then too, so let's just wait. The decision as to how something should be classified is made by taxonomists according to how different a population is from related populations, which is bound to be somewhat arbitrary. And that's a given, but whenever you have, it's just like when you have a law. You have statuettes, where apparently these people went deep down the rabbit hole with it, and they came up with X, so you can use that as a statuette. You have a couple of those, and bingo. We don't have to go through all of this again, do we? You know, that type of thing. So as evolution does its magic, old species, old orders, and even phyla die out and new ones arise. There is, however, no sharp dividing line between a preceding species and the species that it evolves into. Quite often there are changes that are almost unseen. One thing that I was told back more than 35 years ago now, as I speak of, was that it takes a couple of million years to bring about the difference in whales enough to bring about the difference in these few whales that they were trying to show us on this chart and everything, and that's about the same way it worked with a lot of other animals. And that seemed real strange to me, because you could try to compare it to everything else, but then you're looking at humans, and there's been so much variation in between us in just a couple of 100,000 years. And in fact, they were talking about how we all stem from something that was common ancestor 2 million years ago, but it divulged ever since. Well, the out of Africa never meant that it all came as a straight line, though, and we're finding now that it was quite a convoluted line, and back in and out of Africa, if it ever was starting in Africa in the first place, and it might have been an out and in and out and in, and here we go. It gets crazy, but as we get an understanding of it, it won't seem so crazy. They'll come up with a few models, couple of video displays, and you'll be able to go, okay, more like that now. I'll just keep that in mind until you find something else that screws this all up. But at least they're getting a better and better hand on it, constantly on the edge. I've had a couple of videos just come out recently where they found something Neanderthalic that they have unnamed, and because they have so little Denisovan finds, it looks like they might even be able to go, well, hold on a minute, is that Denisovans? Or is it a hybrid? And how does that work when the hybrid interacts with the Peking man type that ends up being Asians, and whenever the South Asians and all the variations on there, how would that play out? If we could figure out any of these lineages other than the Caucasoid one that we have pretty much figured out in front of us, it'd give us a better understanding, and we're starting to get to that point. So they may be somewhat arbitrary, though, they say, and you know, things live and die, and in our modern day everybody has a lament for it, and we're killing the rainforest, and species are dying, and 10 species a day that you never even heard of are dead, so you never heard about them, and we might find some remnant of a bug and go, you know, there used to be a bug. All the way up some of this phylum and order that we were just talking about, though. Where are we at? 23? Then 45 will change. So even if a species splits into two populations that become so different as to be classified as separate species, it is usually not clear unto which of the three species those individuals who lived near the time of the split belonged. If you follow me. When a species evolves, it gradually changes through a few of the changes, though a few of the changes may be sudden in geological time, i.e. they may occur in one individual, then spread throughout the population in tens of thousands of years instead of millions. there can be a hybridization that happens, or something unique that happens, and due to natural selection, it can run through things too. But we're finding now that it's got a lot more to do with hybridization of closely related and or things that separated into, and then that fish hybrid with something else that was somewhat similar that this fish may have been from in the first place, but different now. And then when it flooded again and came back, when they bred back with them, a little bit different, leading to another fish that's a hybrid. So it's not always just, well, they lived in an area that kept getting little and less water, so they did this, and developed. That's why they developed fake spots, and so on them. Changes from one generation to the next are almost always so small that no individual can justifiably be placed in a different species from its parents. So as these things happen, it takes a few things to add up to the point that where somebody's going to go, yeah, it's different enough to where, yeah, it's a little, this whale's a little more humpbacked. But until they got that hump really going on it, there wasn't a lot of a difference between that and a right whale, say, or something. You get the idea. Even if we knew the genome of each and every individual in our lineage, it would be difficult to point to particular mothers and say she and her child are different species. There would be no rollover. We'd have to find examples, and a myriad of it, almost for each year. And then you'd be able to go, oh, here's some popcorn, and that's the first popcorn. Therefore, here's where popcorn deviated from corn. Paleoanthropologists spend a significant amount of their time arguing over whether a fossil is a member of an existing species or is a new species entirely. Often the line of that divide species is drawn where in-between fossils have not yet been found. But even if the bones of every individual from the first to the last were available and in the correct sequence, placing lines that divided the sequence into species would still be arbitrary. In other words, you would be able to see, if you took a picture of now, and you took a picture of 4,000 years ago and you looked at it, you'd be able to go, see the changes? But it takes a longer timeline to do that. Other times, a hybridization just brings something totally different. This fish pretty much looked the same. Same dorsal rays, same everything. Looked the same for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And it was slowly changing, and then all of a sudden, bing. And a lot of these archaeologists and ichthyologists, which is the study of fish, have come to the conclusion that that fish no longer exists, but now it's this. So it no longer exists, but it now lives on in this, which looks somewhat like it, has characteristics. Although some of the times the dorsal ray fin doesn't count. Some things like that, the fins are not correct, so on. So it'd still be arbitrary somewhat if they were to do it in this way. Many people believe that if two animals cannot interbreed, they are different species. And conversely, if they can interbreed, they are the same species. If two animals cannot interbreed, they're always classified as different species. But the example 3 he gives. But if two animals can interbreed, they may or may not be classified as different species. That's an odd one. Let's clarify a little bit. There are many examples where taxonomists have classified two animals as different species, even though they can and do interbreed. Even most dictionaries will not define species as populations that are incapable of interbreeding. Indeed, one of the dictionaries for specifically states related organisms are populations potentially capable of interbreeding. Many species can interbreed, but typically do not. For example, many species of birds, such as the pintail or Anas acuta, and the mallard, which is Anas platyrhynchus, can interbreed. The wolf, Canis lupus, and the dog, Canis lupus familiaris, and the coyote, Canis latrans, and the common jackal, which is Canis aureus, have different species names: lupus, latrans, aureus, so on. Yet they can all interbreed and produce fertile progeny. You can get a half wolf going and so on. I recently did a video about wolves and how a dire wolf, which we always thought was kind of a direct lineage of it, is now found to be more related to the ancient thing that led to dogs in a different way. I've got a whole video about it. But there are different changes there. And then there are also different types of wolves from different locales that have formed different. If you just think of the Brazilian type long-legged wolf that you see versus others, you can see a drastic difference. Also did a video kind of talking about the concept of taxonomy and what's up with that about 2 years ago now, maybe a little more, about jackals and how they had recently reclassified this one that they had always thought, especially because of his markings and thing, it's got to be close, and then they genetically checked it out and they go, no, it's not even a wolf, it's a jackal. It's not even, but it looks alike. So they were really going off of fur as opposed to the other things they could see. But there's so much convergence there, and the animals are so close together, it took genetics to turn around and say, you know, now in the modern day when we have genetics, we're able to actually finally go, you know, but the topic we're talking about now, people were trying to talk about for a long time. They were actually talking about this from the get-go, pretty much in one way, form, or the other, that it seems just like there are birds that are closely related but different, and Darwin's little idea, and growing up on different islands or separated from the other, there are people that have developed that same type of thing. Even if the two species of orangutan, say Pongo abele from Sumatra and Pongo pygmaeus from Borneo, can interbreed, which Angier in 1995 showed, despite having different chromosome numbers even. Number 5, he points out, and so the two species of chimpanzee, the common chimpanzee, Pan troglodytes, and the bonobo chimpanzee, Pan paniscus, and his 6th example, so the fact that all human races can interbreed and produce fertile progeny does not mean that they should be all classified as a single species. All of humanity being different. I guess this is probably the place where I could interject. Whenever I was in school and we thought of this, and they said Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens, sapiens, and I said, well, instead of saying sapiens, sapiens, why isn't it classified just like fish are, as far as locale? And sometimes they'll put SPP, which is basically commonly known as, and so on, and put that on there, and there would be one as Orientalis, there would be one as Australis, there would be one as Eurasis or Eurasian, Erectus. There would be Negroidensis. Homo sapiens this, Homo sapiens that, Homo sapiens this. There would be one Amerindius, but see, at a point here we get things that are derived from other ones. So do we have the same nomenclature on them? Well, in a modern day, everybody's got to get the same weight, right? And everything was the same. Well, no, everything wasn't the same. Everything's not the same. Everything never was the same, apparently. And looking through the way it all works out, genetically, it seems there are enough variation of difference there that's far beyond any taxonomy. But he will explain it to you in a more long, drawn-out way here. Where are we at here, guys? 35. So, the determination of when a population has become sufficiently different from another population to be classified as a new species or subspecies is especially important at the interface between archaic man, Homo sapiens, and the intermediate predecessor, Homo erectus, and between archaic man and modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, and none of the populations thus classified suddenly leaped into a different classification. Erectus, for example, was around for about 2 million years and gradually changed from a very primitive early Erectus ergaster type to a less primitive late Erectus type, after which taxonomists decided to call him archaic sapiens instead of Erectus at a point. So although early Erectus might not have been able to produce hybrids with HSS, certainly late Erectus could have. Some scientists estimate that periods of around 2 million years are required to produce sufficient genetic distance to represent speciation. Curnow noted this in 2003. So there we go again with the idea that it takes about 2 million years for there to be a different species. Well, they also tell us that we were divulged from that for about 2 million years. But you know what's odd? They find ape-type creatures that are up in Europe, around in Greece, and did a video about that too recently, where you have Oranopithecus macedoniensis. So it's like Macedonians. And then there's El Greco, which is Grecopithecus freibergi. The weird thing here is they seem to be the same or slightly variations on a theme, but within a population, and they date not 2.1 million years ago, as we're talking about through this, but 7 million years ago. And therefore, if variations on a theme of derived creatures happened outside and then inside and later inside Africa and came out and mated with those things, i.e. where does Neanderthal come from? Or a better question yet is, once we look at all of the forms of Homo erectus that there are and variations on a theme, you can see quite a bit of variation there that must have been from hybridization. And so, a different hypothesis has to be written about it. A theory comes about, and it's maybe an in and out of Africa instead of out of Africa. Ish. Well, some never went in, and some never went out. So really, that term is negligible for all involved, if you think about it. It's just a simple concept. By the time we were modern humans, there were people outside, and they didn't go in. Although they're saying now that everybody that went out was already a modern form. But there are those that never left. So again, man alone decides whether a population is or is not distinctive enough to be classified as different species. 8. However, we can ask taxonomists to at least be consistent in making these decisions, that is, whatever their criteria are for labeling one population of living things as a species from another, they should apply that same criteria in deciding whether another population of living thing is or is not a separate species. This is clearly not the case now with humans, as there are many species of birds that can interbreed but differ so slightly in coloration that only an expert can tell them apart. There are these bird displays that these guys can go off about, and all these finches and so on, and because of localities now, they don't interbreed, or just like fish, as I was talking about before, and this works in parts of the ocean too, separated over time, and now they don't ever interbreed with each other, but they could. But they don't because there's no connective. There's not a reef close enough to get to another one. In fact, it takes drastic things to happen for them to have ever got separated, or this type to get over here that's like that type over there in places in the ocean too. And there's stopping points to that. I could go off in my videos about it. Let's just leave it at that. And we're about to change, aren't we? There's not much more to the second part. It'll probably go 10 minutes if. So they should be consistent about what they do, though. But this is clearly not the case, he's saying. Different birds and so on, slight colorations, finnage on fish and things like that can make a difference. But adults can correctly determine the race of a person about 85% of the time just from his silhouette. A 3-month-old baby, at the point of being able to make eye contact and discern, can tell the difference. This has been noted in all kinds of tests that I think he's referring to and are well aware of. But David Inco in 2007 showed that you can tell someone from their silhouette. Taxonomists should not apply this criteria of speciation to animals other than man, and a different criterion to man himself. It's what I talked about in the very first point of it, to where it seems like we have a different, and because it's us, and because of feelings, we've tried to, now here's the statement on the way out here, well, I've got a minute or two. We've tried to be so inclusive in things, it's crazy compared to what we do in taxonomy, in reality, in real life. For people try to find any little thing they can about these fish, and even their gill rakers, and one fin number count, and this, that, and the other, and aha, and we've got a different name, and get to name it, and it's something totally different. They do so about most every creature on this planet, but whenever it gets to humans, it is shut down, boy, chop chop. And again, because of feelings and so on. Ample evidence is provided in this book and its citations to support the conclusion that races are actually real and not a delusional concocted by evil racists. But there's some evidence raises another question. Is the evidence adequate to classify Africans or sub-Saharans not just as different race, but as the different species Homo africanus? Well, I think African would actually be incorrect somewhat, because that was a Caucasian name that was given to the land there, named after Caucasians and stuff. That's where Africa and Africanus comes from. So it would have to be something more, and probably Negroidensis, but then you'd have to break it down into Khoisanensis and the pygmies that are there, and Pygmaeus, and you know, and East African and Dinkas, and because there's so many variations of unrelated, really, sub-Saharans. That's why they talk about being so much variation. The Caucasians are always